Hello, and welcome to the fourth in our series of 12 lessons from the book of Job. Job chapter 3, where we see Job finally will start to speak concerning what he's going through. But before that, let's jump back to chapter 2, and from chapter 2, we'll read from verse 11. Job 2, beginning at verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. What do we know about these 3 friends of Job? Well, they evidently came from a distance and would have to receive word about Job before sending messengers to each other to arrange a time to meet up and then travel to where Job was. How long did all that take? Days, weeks, maybe even months. But on arrival, they were so horrified at the sight they couldn't talk for a week. Remember, we're told that Job would scrape at his boils with broken pottery. Dried blood would be all around. He would be in a terrible state, and these people really didn't recognize him. Their actions were the actions of people who were at a funeral. Their raised voices, weeping, tearing their robes, sprinkling dust on their heads, added up to them thinking he was on his deathbed, and in effect they held a funeral for him. The period of mourning was 7 days and nights. We can see in other places such as Genesis 50 and verse 10 and 1 Samuel chapter 31 and verse 13. Others who were mourning mourned for the same length of time, a full week. These friends couldn't find words of comfort due to what they thought the reason behind his suffering was. But silently, it seems, they came to the conclusion that behind the suffering of Job there must be some terrible sin that God is now punishing him for. What is it, as they sat there, that they were thinking, looking at Job and trying to work things out? Well, it would seem after their initial shock, they sat and thought, well, we'll know exactly what they were thinking when they begin to speak. They obviously started to harden their hearts against Job, thinking he's suffering this way because he deserves it. God was right to treat him this way. They came to comfort him, but now they needed to confront him. They sat in silence, wondering how to do it so that Job would listen. After Job cries out to God, we hear his 3 friends try to explain to Job why he is going through what he is going through. But don't forget, we have already been shown at the beginning of the book what this is all about. Ultimately, God is doing this, and there is a purpose. Though we know what is happening, we don't really know the purpose. So it's as though we can suffer along with Job, with what he's feeling, his sense of protest and his anguish. The reason will become known and made clear as the book unfolds. Having sat in silence for 7 days in the presence of his friends, who had actually come to comfort him, Job finally speaks. In fact, the book is mainly a series of discussions between Job and his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They tried to arrive at some reason for these tragedies. Their talks took place over a long period. He was a man known far and wide as godly, upright, and benevolent. Yet suddenly he found himself in the depths. Why? We are still asking, we are still troubled over the apparent undeserved sufferings in the world. The question is universal, yet personal. So these philosophical friends turned into prosecutors. They came to sympathise, but stayed to criticise, and the accusations only added to this poor man's grief. The gist of their reasoning is this: God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. Therefore, they conclude that Job's intense suffering must be the result of the most grievous sins. They plead with him to confess his transgressions and to repent. When he insisted upon his innocence, they charged that he only added to his sin by refusing to admit his wrongs. The friends stated many truths, but the error was in their application. So in the end, they actually taught falsely. This is evident by the Lord's eventual rebuke and his rejection of their conclusion. And so the scene is set. We're now set up for the major argument of the book and the major attack on Job's faith. It will not be physical now. It moves to a spiritual attack on Job's relationship with God. Most surprisingly, it comes through well-meaning friends, misguided and sincere friends who want to help and hope that they're helping. However, they are an instrument of Satan used to assault Job in an attempt to cause his faith to collapse. Here's an outline of Job's speech. It begins first of all by cursing the day of his birth and the night of his conception for failing to prevent his sorrow in chapter 3 and the first 10 verses. Then from verse 11 to 19 he bemoans why he didn't die at birth or be stillborn, because then at least he would be at rest, just like those who were great in their lifetime or like those who had been oppressed. They're the same at death, they're at rest in the grave. Job also wonders in the concluding verses 20 to 26, why those suffering who long for death are allowed to linger. He concludes by stating that what he most greatly feared has now come upon him, trouble from which there appears to be no rest. We read in the first 10 verses where Job basically curses the day of his birth. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those who curse it, who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. He certainly did curse the day of his birth. His troubles were extreme, of course, and we sense the severe agitation it caused by the way he's talking. This might excuse what he says in a way, but he can't be justified in it. He has forgotten already the good that he was born to, and now he's filled with thoughts of only the bad. In fact, he wishes he had never been born at all. The prophet Jeremiah himself expressed his pain in similar language to this. He had an unpopular ministry. In Jeremiah 15 and verse 10, chapter 20 verses 14 to 18, and in other places as well, we see that he experienced a great deal of suffering just like Job. Both expressed a desire never to have been born. But we have to note, neither Job nor Jeremiah for a moment considered the possibility of suicide. They might have questioned the Lord's wisdom, but they didn't take the precious gift of life which he had given to them. We can probably guess that Job, whilst wealthy and prosperous, blessed God for the day of his birth. But now that has changed. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1 says that the day of death is better than the day of birth. For the faithful follower of Christ it is. But if you hadn't been born, you would not later have the privilege of passing from this life and going into the very presence of God. These expressions in Job seem inconsistent with the existence of true devotion to God. But we have to remember, Job had far less understanding than we have. Before we blame him too severely, we must place ourselves in his circumstances and ask what our devotional time would have sounded like under the trials which afflicted him. He lived in an early period of the world when the views of God's rule and government were obscure. It was not sustained by the hopes and promises which the faithful disciple possesses now. We have the full revelation to hand to refer to. Job's knowledge was probably that of tradition, verbal history that had been passed down, the result of careful observation on the course of life's events. What information could he really turn to for consolation? He had few or no promises to sustain him. He did not have before him, as we have, the example of Jesus, who patiently suffered for our sake. As his followers, we often remark on how we haven't suffered as much as Jesus did. But Job hasn't got that to cling on to. His faith was not sustained by those strong assurances which we have of the perfect goodness of God's rule. However, while we cannot but admire his speech's force and eloquence, its unequalled power and boldness in passionately expressing his feelings, at the same time there was a lack of proper submission, and he was certainly impatient. It is the talk of a man who felt that he could bear no more, and there can be no doubt that it gave to Satan the hope of his anticipated triumph. But even so, it was not as bad as Satan had hoped. Job did curse the day of his birth, but he did not curse his God. He, of course, was weary of this life, and he would gladly have parted with it, but he was not weary of God. He resolutely clings to his faith and will never let it go. The dispute between God and Satan concerning Job was not whether Job had his weaknesses and whether he was subject to feelings as we are. That was a given, and we can certainly witness that. The dispute was, is he a hypocrite who secretly served God for what he could get? If he were provoked, would he show his true feelings? These trials proved that it wasn't like that. Though he did speak unadvisedly, he expressed great submission and resignation to the holy will of God, and eventually he did repent of his impatience. He condemned himself for it, and therefore God didn't condemn him, and nor must we. We learn that we must also watch ourselves in such trying times. Though Job didn't curse God, he didn't really seek after him either. So what exactly was the quarrel with the day of his birth and the night of his conception? It's because it did not shut up the doors of his mother's womb, in verse 10 of chapter 3. Is this Job, who was so admired for his wisdom that men listened and kept silent as he gave his advice? Surely his wisdom failed him when he expressed his desire that he had never been born. At best, that's a vain wish. You have no control over your being born into this world or not. Surely his wisdom failed him when he poured out curses upon a day and a night that couldn't be hurt or made any worse for his curses. They had already happened. His wisdom failed him when he wished horrendous things on his own mother. If she could not have given birth when her full time had come, it would have brought about her death, and what a miserable death that would have been. His wisdom failed him as he now despised the goodness of God towards him, giving him an excellent life, far above that of any other person. He now undervalued the gift as not worth the acceptance, because it was full of trouble. What a foolish thing it was to wish that his eyes had never seen the light, so that they might not have seen sorrow. Did Job believe and hope that he should, in his flesh, see God, as he says in chapter 19 and verse 26? Did Job really think, if I've got to put up with this before I can see God, I would rather of never have been born? He goes on to say that, well, if he had to be born, why couldn't he die at birth, from verse 11 onwards? Why did I not die at birth, and come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breast that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet, I would have slept, then I would have been at rest, with kings and counsellors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. So why didn't I die as soon as I was born? I wonder if Job reflects on his foolishness, because he can't do anything about the day of his birth, and he certainly wouldn't want his mother to suffer. So let's change tack and ask, why didn't I die as soon as I was born? Satan was deceived, thinking Job would give everything to save his own life. Well, no one valued life at a lower rate than Satan did. Job ungratefully quarrels with life, and is angry that it was not taken from him as soon as it was given to him, in verses 11 and 12. We are helpless creatures when we come into the world, and the thread of life is very thin. We are ready to die from the womb and to breathe our last as soon as we begin to breathe at all. We are fully and totally dependent upon those around about us at birth. And it's true, as soon as we're born, we're preparing to die. We can do nothing for ourselves as other creatures can. He applauds death and the grave as something to be desired. To desire to die so that we could be with Christ and be free from sin is one thing. It's an effect of God's grace towards us. Because we are forgiven and in a right relationship with God through His grace, we are prepared to die and meet our Maker. But a desire to die only so you can be quiet in the grave and be delivered from the troubles of this life is quite wrong. Consider Romans 14 and verse 8. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Job is thinking that if he had died as soon as he was born, if he was carried from the womb straight to the grave, then that would be better for him. In verse 13, he says, those that are now troubled will be out of the reach of trouble in the grave. The wicked can't hurt you there. When persecutors die, they cannot persecute any more. There's no hatred and envy in the grave. They will perish. Herod afflicted the church, the early church in the book of Acts, but when he became food for worms, he stopped troubling them. He was dead, problem solved. When the persecuted die, they're out of danger of being troubled any further. If Job could be at rest in the grave, he would have had no disturbance. None of his enemies would have created any trouble for him. Those who are enslaved on earth are free in death, he says. Death is the prisoner's discharge. It is the relief of the oppressed. It is the servant's freedom. They are no more trampled, insulted, terrified by cruel taskmasters. They can no longer hear the voice of the oppressor. Those who are separated socially from others are on the same level now in verse 19. The pomp and ceremony of the rich and famous, it's all gone in the grave. All the inconveniences that the poor and lowly experience are also over in the grave. The grave shows no difference to any of these people. No difference between rich and poor, wise and foolish, cowards and the brave. The weary are at rest in the grave. Heaven is more than rest to the saints. The grave is only a rest to the body. Job's view of death applies only to those who die in the Lord. Revelation 14 and verse 13 tells us, "Blessed are those who die in the Lord." But for the wicked, death holds no rest. The story of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16 verses 19 to 31 will bear that out for us. Job argues against being born, but he was born. He argues, why couldn't he have died as soon as he was born, or be stillborn? Well, he didn't. He lived. So now he asks, what about now? While I'm suffering right now. So in verse 20 of chapter 3 it goes on to say, why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death? But it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. Why is life given to those who linger in suffering? Why must he go on living? What about those who long for death, who have outlived their comforts, their usefulness, who are now burdened with age and infirmity, who suffer pain or sickness, are experiencing poverty or disgrace, and yet death doesn't happen to release them from it? And at the same time, it comes to many who dread it. The continuance of life must be according to God's will, not according to ours. Even those who long for death, what about those who dig for it as for hidden treasure? That is, they would give anything for a fair dismissal out of this world. This supposes that we could be our own executioner. Those who bid it welcome are glad when they can find the grave and see themselves stepping into it. If life is so miserable, and it prevails to make death itself desirable, what hope is there? How much more desirable is the hope and prospect of a better life that death can take us to? Dying to your old life to be raised up to a new life, which then takes away the sting of physical death, which is a passage to a far better place. We understand that now. But what did Job know? Job thinks himself hard done by. Is there no other way out of this suffering, this pain and misery, than death? To be impatient of life due to the troubles we meet is ungrateful to the giver of life. It shows a sinful indulgence of our desires rather than consideration of our future state, which we must be preparing for. And for us, that's heaven. We must leave it to God as to when we can go there. Job talks in this concluding statement about the one whom God has hedged in. The meaning here is that God had surrounded him with a high wall or a hedge, so he couldn't move freely. Job asks with impatience why light, that is his life, should be given to such a man. Why should he not be permitted to die? This closes the complaint of Job, and the remaining verses of the chapter contain a statement of his sorrowful condition. In regard to the questions proposed by Job in chapter 3 from verses 20 to 23, there was doubtless much impatience on his part and improper feeling. The language shows that Job was not absolutely sinless, but we can't be harsh on him. What he says is a statement of feelings which we might have often felt ourselves, even if we didn't express it like Job did. The questions themselves might be difficult to answer, and certainly none of the friends of Job could give a solution to the difficulty. What is asked is why someone is kept in misery on earth when they would gladly be released by death. Maybe some of the reasons could be given here. Sufferings may be the means needed to develop the true state of the soul, as was the case with Job. There were certainly things wrong in the way he thought, and the way he thought God had a relationship with him. His sufferings caused him to question this, and we'll see, as we progress, the realization that he comes to. It could well be the proper punishment for sin in the heart, which the individual wasn't fully aware of. Things such as pride, the love of comfort, self-confidence, leading to a lack of dependence on God, ambition, and a desire for reputation. These things appear to be the sins of Job. Suffering is needed to teach true submission, to show if we are willing to resign ourselves to God. It's easy for us to be what we might call a fair weather Christian, but will we remain faithful to God even through trying times? Suffering might be necessary to prepare the individual to die. For a sinner, the grave contains no rest. The eternal world gives no rest. Such sorrow from suffering might show the wicked how intolerable future pain will be, and how important it is for them to be ready to die. If they cannot bear the pain and the sorrows of a few hours in this short life, how can they endure eternal suffering? The true place to be released from suffering for a sinner is not the grave, it's in the pardoning mercy of God. Heaven is the only real rest from suffering and from sin. So though he doesn't sin with his lips, he has a problem and is trying to figure it out. After the first trial, Job praised God. After the second trial, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, however, that time has passed, he is no longer submissive and doesn't sin with his lips. But Job's problem is that if his theology is correct, he is the chief of sinners. But he doesn't think he's a sinner. Therefore, his theology is wrong. This thought is probably more agonizing than that he is the chief of sinners, because the whole basis of his life, his whole relationship with God that he thought he had, is now based on some wrong ideas. What's he going to do? He no doubt thinks his friends have come to comfort him, but instead he gets an argument. He dreaded the suffering that has come to him. Now he is troubled and is no longer at ease. What is the answer?